After 130 years, the historic Arrowtown Masonic Lodge was showing its age. The building badly needed structural repairs, but within its walls, this grand old structure held some surprising secrets. Join us then for a brief history of the lodge known as Arrow Kilwinning, number 86. By 2005, Lodge members agreed that this splendid old building needed essential repairs. Funds had to be raised, and Blair Roger put up his hand.
Well, I came from Invercargill, and I was past master of Lodge St John down there. Came here and was fairly busy at the time, but I still went along to the meetings. Then I joined, that would be 10 years ago, and it was following on from there. And they were always commenting about, oh, I wonder if the roof's going to last the next winter. And that was when I said I'd fix it.
Earlier modifications to Kilwinning Lodge in the 1940s or 50s included lining the walls. Trenches were cut into the plaster to take 4x2s, and Pinex sheets were fixed over the top. Architect Jackie Gillies specialises in historic buildings.
When we took the Pinex off, we discovered these absolutely amazing wall paintings beneath the Pinex, which put it in a probably unique category in New Zealand. Otherwise it would have just been an absolutely amazing interior of a Masonic lodge, but now it's truly extraordinary.
This discovery propelled the restoration project into a whole new league, as Blair was soon to learn.
The original money that we wanted for a grant, about $151,000, that was put into place and things were moving, but then when they took the Pinex off, the whole project has certainly become a bit bigger than I thought it was going to be.
The original wall paintings were a spectacular find, but the lodge held another surprise.
And I just started thinking, well, I wonder what's underneath the hardboard where the more recent lino, black and white tessellated floor, had just been removed. So we pulled back the carpet and discovered the original painted canvas floor underneath.
While every Masonic lodge has a tessellated floor, this one is quite unique. It's made from canvas, most likely recycled from an old miner's tent.
It's in remarkable condition because it's actually been protected for the last 50 years by a layer of carpet underlay and then the hardboard, and it's absolutely stunning.
Who painted these remarkable murals? Our story begins in the 1840s, when New Zealand was still a young country. The Wakatipu Basin was predominantly a farming area, and Arrowtown didn't exist. David Clark is the director of the Lakes District Museum.
I think everyone knows that Arrowtown was founded when gold was discovered in the Arrow River in 1862, October, by a Maori shepherd boy, Jack Tiwa, who was working for the founder of Queenstown, William Rees, and he was looking after sheep out here, walked into the river and found this gold. He was sworn to secrecy by William Rees. The last thing William Rees wanted was a bunch of miners arriving. He had sheep to shear. He was quite happy being a farmer. If you're a young shepherd boy who's found handfuls of gold and you've been sworn to secrecy, it's probably not easy to keep that secret, and ultimately he let the secret slip.
There were rich pickings and miners invaded the area en masse. A charismatic American called William Fox soon established a group of miners beyond the narrow entrance to the Arrow Gorge. This calico and tent settlement, originally known as Fox's, was later renamed after the river. They called it Arrowtown.
The rush was on, thousands of miners swept into the Arrow Gorge and formed the beginnings of the Arrowtown Township. Anything you could find to knock up some shelter, some rudimentary grog shanties, some supply networks were put in place.
By the end of 1862, around 800 miners were working the entrance to the Arrow Gorge, and as many as 2,000 men were working the creek beds upstream. They lived in stone and sod huts in poor conditions. Further up the river, the settlement of Macetown was born. Many of the early settlers who arrived here belonged to lodges in their homeland, and masonry was established early in the new colony. David Mace is a former Grand Master of Freemasons, New Zealand.
4 of my great uncles came out from Bedale in Yorkshire. They went to Ballarat and Bendigo, and then they came to Macetown and mined what is known as a 12-mile area. And while they didn't stay there for a particularly long time, Macetown ended up by being named after them, and then they went to various parts of New Zealand following that.
By all accounts, the Mace brothers were characters. Around this time, they even played cricket against an England team. At its peak, Macetown supported around 500 people. The Mace brothers built a hotel and a large store here in 1863. But that year, the winter was severe. 6 days of warm rain combined with snowmelt, and the Shotover, Kabarau and Arrow rivers rose by 6 to 10 metres overnight. Altogether, more than 100 miners lost their lives in just 1 month, as tents and makeshift huts were swept away. That's when lodges came into their own.
I sort of see them as insurance companies for the early workers. They didn't have any insurance protection, and if you were a member of the lodge, then if something happened to you, your wife and children, or your spouse and children, were protected. It was at that stage then they probably thought, well, if we're going to carry on mining here, we better think about laying down the foundations of a more permanent town up on the next level away from the river. And so we get some of the earliest buildings being established in 1863, 1864.
The infrastructure to service the growing number of miners was developing fast, and agriculture was taking off in the area. By the end of 1864, there were 19 stores and shops in Arrowtown. Many of those buildings still stand today.
In 1865, a gold rush on the west coast took all the miners, or many of the miners, over to the west coast, leaving the local merchants deprived of an economy, no miners spending money.
With miners deserting the central Otago goldfields, the Otago provincial government encouraged Chinese miners to the area. The Chinese were meticulous, winning gold by reworking abandoned tailings. Within 5 years, there were more than 2,500 Chinese miners working the area. These foreigners suffered prejudice from European miners and set up their own camp on the banks of the Arrow River. The historic Chinese village on the outskirts of Arrowtown is a popular tourist attraction these days and still bears testament to the harsh conditions the Chinese endured. Over the hill in Queenstown, the Lake Lodge of Ophir was already active. This is the oldest building in Queenstown and remains the oldest New Zealand lodge still functioning in its original premises. But travelling between Queenstown and Arrowtown for meetings was often precarious. The roads were rough and bridges sometimes impassable. From 1878, lodge members gathered in Pritchard's store. From these humble beginnings sprung the Arrow Lodge.
Robert Pritchard, the founder of that store, was a prominent lodge member, and that store was built in about 1864 at the far end of Buckingham Street. It still exists to this day. It's now the local pharmacy. It used to be a big 2-storied shop, and at the back of the shop was a residence, and they would meet either upstairs or in the residence for their early lodge meetings. If you look at the lodge members, they tended to be the same names that were in the council when it was formed in 1874. They seem to be the movers and the shakers of the town. They've come from diverse walks of life. They've been associated in lodges back in their home country. So you get a mixture of merchants, mine managers, the doctors and the lawyers and the professions, but also the workers.
While the easy alluvial pickings were drying up, there was still gold to be won in rich quartz reefs further up the Arrow.
The town still managed to eke out a living. There was plenty of mining going on up the rivers. Enough miners remained behind, but we have a town that's a little bit stagnant, but we have faith in the people that remained here that something permanent was going to happen.
On the 13th of February 1879, the lodge was formally opened under the Scottish Constitution. The installation meeting was held in the Arrowtown Hall, and the joining fee was set at £1, 6 shillings and sixpence. There was a levy of 2 guineas which went towards the formation of the lodge, which was formerly known as Lodge Arrow Kilwinning, number 637.
The original Kilwinning Lodge was in Scotland, where Robbie Burns was brought up down in the southwest, and the lodge he belonged to was Kilwinning.
The English started their Grand Lodge of England, and the Scots decided they would have their Grand Lodge, and Kilwinning was one of the initial area that got the lodges working, and they actually were superseded by one of the other stronger guys. He got in his name and he put their lodge in as number 1, which upset the Kilwinning, so they called theirs Naught. So the original lodge is Kilwinning number 0 of the Scottish Constitution.
In 1886, the current section was purchased for £27. Plans were submitted, and a Queenstown builder won the tender for the princely sum of £239 and 10 shillings. The foundation stone was laid in April 1887.
As a result of work done with Richard John Seddon, of course, to become Prime Minister of New Zealand, with the United Grand Lodge of England, we formed our own sovereign Grand Lodge in 1890, and many of the English, Scottish and Irish joined the New Zealand Grand Lodge, but we still have today Irish, Scottish and English lodges who owe their loyalty and fealty directly to their mother countries. And that adds to some of the character of masonry in New Zealand, which is quite unique.
On the 8th of March 1893, the Arrowtown Lodge reopened under the New Zealand Constitution. From this point forward, it would be named Lodge Arrow Kilwinning, number 86. 4 years later, a Mr. David Henderson was contracted to apply 3 coats of interior plaster to the lodge walls. While the murals were most likely painted at around the same time, lodge records hold no clue to the artist's identity.
By the turn of the century, after the 1890s, there's an economic recession in New Zealand, so things slow down a little bit, and Arrowtown starts to become a little bit of a sleepy farming town. By 1915, all the quartz mines in Macetown have closed down. The industry's run out of steam, further exacerbated by World War I, when a number of men are killed and the town gets decimated to some extent of its young men.
Masonry, certainly they were impacted by not only the Depression, but the 2 great wars. And as such, and I think an excellent example here of the impact of the Great War in 1914-1918 is to go down to Glenorchy and look at the War Memorial there, where virtually every male in Glenorchy was killed.
Many of the early lodge members travelled from afar, from Bullendale, Macetown, Skippers and even Cardrona. Quite a ride in those days.
When I joined the lodge, there was an elderly man, Doug Rowe, had been a member for many years, and he said that he could remember when the musterers rode in for practices at night, and quite a few members from Cardrona in those days, and when we did up the lodge about 40 years ago, we found little indentations in the timber, and he said that was the hobnail boots marks of the musterers. They just used to come in with the gear they'd been working in to do their practices. So they must have really been enthusiastic to ride from Cardrona to Arrowtown for a practice and then back to Cardrona for their next day's work. Unreal.
And then from then on, right through to about the late 1940s, the town almost goes the same way as Macetown and Skippers and Bullendale. It becomes a ghost town. It gets down to, probably 80 to 100 people living in the town. The schools just survive and no more. The high school closes down. The churches have got no parishioners. And then in the 1940s, New Zealand holidaymakers think, oh, this is a nice little place back and beyond to come up for our holidays.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream.
And the first cribbies buy some land, and it becomes a really popular summer destination.
Arrowtown's new popularity coincided with a renewed interest in masonry worldwide.
After the Second World War, it enjoyed throughout the world a massive resurgence because men had been spending time with men and enjoyed the fraternising with it. And masonry throughout the world enjoyed its largest membership numbers in the late 40s and 1950s.
New members brought a clean broom to the lodge. It was around this time that an attempt was made to modernise the building. Deep trenches were gouged into the paintwork and Pinex was used to line the walls. The old artwork would be lost for more than 50 years.
We think it was probably the 1950s, and it's understandable for that time that there was a move to make things look fresh and new and clean, and Pinex was used a